Good evening and welcome. My name is Bren Carlu and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. This evening we have a really exciting panel and a really full panel, so I'm going to cut to the chase and introduce the people. The reason I'm introducing all of these people is that they are all Australians and they have all made Aliyah over the last few years, which is really interesting and really important at this current time because the global pandemic we're currently living through has actually skyrocketed inquiries and about and attempts to make Aliyah. So I think it'd be quite fascinating listening to everyone's story, how they've made Aliyah, why they made Aliyah, and how they're doing in Israel today. So our first guest lives in Rosh Pinah. He is a pediatrician in Ziv Hospital in Sfat and a senior lecturer at Bar Ilan University. Hailing from Melbourne, Dr. Michael Harari moved to Israel for the second time in 2011 and once the Syrian civil war started, began treating children injured or otherwise affected by the war. A man of many talents, Michael is also a goat farmer, cheesemaker and tour guide. He joins us now from an inpatient clinic in Ziv Hospital. Our second guest is Sarah Vanunu. Originally from Sydney, Sarah moved to Israel in 2005 and lives in Tel Aviv with her husband and 3 children. Sarah has 15 years experience in marketing, global PR and communications, including extensive experience with Israel diaspora campaigns. She has spoken at major public events and is a longtime volunteer for the ZFA. She is the co-founder and co-admin of the Australians Living in Israel Facebook group, and she was one of the co-organisers of the Australian bushfire relief event earlier this year. Our third guest is Tali Amir, originally from Sydney. Tali was active in Zionist activity in her youth, including serving as a madricha on Israel programs and then as the Israel program director for August in 2011. It was in this role that she met the man who would become her husband. She moved to Israel shortly afterwards and with him moved to the Arava. She had visited the Arava with the Australia-Arava Partnership, which is part of the ZFA. Tali and her husband are both tour guides. And our final guest is Jason Blankfield, who moved to Israel from Perth in 2010. After serving in an elite unit in the IDF, he established Peak State Performance to coach and mentor professional athletes. And in 2019, he established Frontline Leadership, a mentoring business that works with millennial business leaders, startups, professional athletes, and more. He holds a Bachelor in Sports Science from the University of Western Australia. And Jason, in fact, went to Israel on a Birthright program in 2005, and Birthright is, of course, organised out of the ZFA. Now, that sounds like the introduction to the sale of the century. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our moderator this evening, who is Phil Chester, and he is a former president of the ZFA. Phil.
Thank you, Bren, and welcome everybody to our very popular Zionist Federation of Australia Lockdown Learning session this evening, which I'm honoured and excited to be moderating tonight. Whilst our panelists tonight may not be famous politicians, academics or journalists, as we've had in previous lockdown conversations, as Australian Olim living in and making their own personal contributions to building the Jewish state, in my own personal opinion, they're actually the biggest stars that we can have the privilege to showcase. Whilst we perhaps don't talk enough about Aliyah, it is actually and must always continue to be the highest ideal of our Zionist movement. And that's why this evening is so important. As Bren said, you may be interested to know that in spite of, or perhaps because of these difficult times we all find ourselves in, Aliyah inquiries to the ZFA office have increased significantly lately. And although flights out of Australia are currently very difficult, some of our new Olim have recently arrived in Israel to start their new lives. I should also declare a personal interest at the outset, which makes tonight even more enjoyable for me. My oldest son, David, made Aliyah over 12 years ago and now lives in Tel Aviv with his Israeli-born wife, Hadass, and they're both working as lawyers in private practice. So without further ado, I want to hand over to the panelists. Bren's done a good job of bios, but we want to explore that in a little bit more detail. So I want to start first, and everyone's going to have the chance to answer this. And with 4 speakers, it's going to be a full evening, but hopefully everyone will have a good chance to tell their story and give their opinions. And if we're really lucky, hopefully we'll get some questions from the audience as well. So perhaps we'll start with Sarah. And I just want an idea, tell us a bit about your backstory, what motivated you to make Aliyah, and in a bit more detail, what are you doing in Israel now?
Sure, thank you very much. I will admit that I'm slightly anxious here because I'm currently in quarantine and I've got the kids behind that door, and I'm just hoping that they're not going to burst in and Zoom bomb this conversation. It wouldn't be the first time, so hoping we can get through this quietly. I'm originally from Sydney, as you said, and I went through Jewish day school education, Mount Sinai College, Moriah, went to UNSW. And my first trip to Israel was one of the very first birthright trips. I think I was the second year that it was available. It was my first time, and I extended my stay and backpacked around the country. And I guess to cut a long story short, I came home engaged to an Israeli. My poor parents, I don't know if you're watching there, but mum and dad, we've gone through this, and it's been 15 years, so, you know, all turned out okay in the end. But yes, I met my husband to be at the end of that trip. He's a jazz musician at a bar in Jerusalem, and today we live in Tel Aviv with our 3 kids, and he's still a jazz musician, and I'm a marketing manager at a high-tech company.
And what motivated you? Was it love or more than that to make Aliyah?
Well, I mean, I guess I had a bit of the Zionist bug just from my my upbringing. Came from a family, you know, learning about Israel all my life, and I was involved in Jewish youth movements. So definitely had the Zionist bug, but the trip to Israel was a definite boost to that, seeing it all come to life. And then, of course, you know, came here for love, and then trying to find my way in a very strange country and building community and building ties. Soon after I moved here, I felt we didn't really have this. I moved here before I was even on Facebook. I think I didn't even have a smartphone at the time. And it wasn't so easy to try and get answers to simple things like, where do you get your passport photo taken in Tel Aviv? Or where do you find a driving instructor that speaks English that can teach me on, you know, on manual? So all sorts of questions like these that I felt it was very hard to find the answers to. And my friends and I made a group on Facebook for other Australians living in Israel where we could find out information about this sort of thing, you know, renewing your driver's license, passport, that sort of stuff. And that group of Australians living in Israel has grown and blossomed to over 3,000 people today. It's a very active group, and it's a very helpful group. And we get together and we do things, and we celebrate Australia Day, and we talk about where to watch the footy, or we talk about you know, raising funds for the bushfire relief event, which we did earlier this year. We had over 1,000 people, and we raised money for Australia.
Well, let's talk a bit about that a bit more later, Sarah. One quick question. Did you speak Hebrew before you made Aliyah? Was your Hebrew good?
I learned Hebrew at school. I was a bit shy to speak it because from leaving school at the age of 18 to when I, you know, came here a few years later, I hadn't used it at all. But it did come back to me when I went to Ulpan. So I definitely had the foundations.
And from what you said, I assume when you made your first trip, Aliyah wasn't on your mind. You didn't have this burning desire at school or in the youth movement.
You know, when you do these birthright trips, you've got mega events. We had Bibi Netanyahu at the time speak to thousands of people talking to us about how Israel is your home. And I remember being in the audience at that mega event, thinking to myself, who is he talking to here? Who wants to move here? Who would swap Australia for Israel? And then I became the first one to bite the dust.
All right, very interesting. All right, Michael, Dr. Harari, let's hear from you.
I think I owe my Aliyah to the year 1967. My parents come from Syria and Egypt, and in 1967, the Six-Day War, I was a 12-year-old boy in Melbourne, and I discovered several things. Firstly, I discovered my father hunched over what was then in common use, a shortwave radio, day and night, trying to ward off in his heart the fear that Israel might be destroyed or annihilated. He'd come from a country where he felt that anti-Semitism was rife, And for him, I have to say that for all of his life, the Zionist notion was an almost holy one. Some of that sort of trickled down to us. So in '67, I would get out of my bed at night and see my father hunched with this haggard look over the shortwave radio, and I imbibed some of his fear, and that fear has stayed with me to this day, I suspect. But the other thing I think was the fact that he comes from Syria, and the notion that Israel is somehow mine, not only in a biblical or national sense, but also our family comes from this neck of the woods. And I contrasted that against the aboriginality of Australian Aborigines, and I envied their connection to the soil, to the soil between their toes, if you like. And on my first visit here, I felt that connection in a way that I hadn't felt in Australia. And even though Australia is a wonderful country, really, I suspect the best country in the world, the lore of that feeling of belonging was so strong and got stronger over the years. And my envy for how the Australian Aborigines felt for their aboriginality, I think that combination of those two realizations in the year 1967, both the war and my Syrianness, they were both the triggers that ultimately led to me making Aliya twice.
But Michael, you made Aliya a bit later in life than the other three panelists, so it was a bit of a process for you. You mentioned '67, but what was the trigger that finally pushed you after, you were a well-established pediatrician in Melbourne? What was the final, motivator?
I made Aliya twice. The first time as a 30-something-year-old, and I left because my mother got sick, but I didn't leave happily. I left reluctantly. I was a very happy Ole in the 1980s. I went back to Australia and got more and more committed to Australia. I didn't come here because the pediatrics were so wonderful. I came here because of the sense of belonging that I had always felt here was a strong attraction for me, and the sense of not belonging in Australia, despite the abundance of wonderful things about Australia, that sense of belonging, a secular spiritual absence, which I did feel here in Israel, that I felt that its presence here in Israel, that's what eventually got me to come back here in my early 50s. And after having spent 8 years here in the 1980s when I was 30-something years old.
Okay, now you're doing very interesting work with Syrian patients and Israeli patients and Arab Israeli patients. Talk to us a bit about that, and do you see this as a fulfillment of your Zionist ideals, or it's just something you fell into? What's driving all of that?
Yes, to all of the above. It started in the Israeli involvement with the Syrians started in 2013, some 2 years after the outbreak of the civil war there, the Arab Spring so-called. And it was very hard from Rosh Pina, which is where I live in the far north, to listen to the daily sort of tympanic bombardment of Syrians within Syria. It's very hard to sit on your back veranda and not be touched or not be aware of what was happening, some 10 kilometers away from us. But I think when we got involved as Israelis in 2013, it was a very dramatic thing. You come to the Middle East a little bit aware of the claustrophobic nature of being an Israeli. We're surrounded on three sides by people who are at times sworn to our destruction, and the sea is the other border. And suddenly to have one of the borders open up to you was a revelation. It was inspiring and it was uplifting, and I could run out of cliches before I'd adequately described what it did to those of us who were involved in it. And thankfully, by chance, I was offered the chance to coordinate the treatment of the children who crossed the border. They primarily came to Tzfat, where I happened to be working. And it was a life-changing event for me. I realized that life-changing is yet another cliche, but I can't find another way of describing it. It was so uplifting and so radical to have this hermetically sealed border suddenly develop cracks or a porous nature such that people could now cross this border, and to get to know people who lived on the other side of the border, and to, what the hell, to have breakfast with them and get to know them. Syrians of all people committed to our own destruction. There was a tremendous feeling, and it actually changed the way I felt here in the Middle East.
In what way?
So it was another string to the bow of this feeling of belonging.
And Michael, maybe it's a little philosophical, but do you think as a bit of an outsider coming in, it was easier for you to deal with the other, the foreigner, the enemy, the Syrian, than perhaps Israeli doctors may have? Or was there a team of you and there really was no distinction in terms of how you related to them?
Well, there was a team of us. I think anyone who's worked in the Israeli health system realizes that we all treat one another without any regard. It doesn't seem contrived or forced that, you know, Arabs treat Jews, or Jews Arabs, or Druze or Christians, and it's so unforced that it makes a lie of much of the propaganda that's fed to people about Israel. So it was completely unforced, and there was such a strong desire to do it because of the carnage that was happening on the other side of the border. And it was with a sense of relief, not just my relief, but a collective sense of relief, that we started taking Syrians in, because at least we could feel that we were doing something, even if it was only 4,000 Syrians who crossed the border out of the 500,000 that are displaced and killed there. It was with an enormous sense of relief that we were able to do something, however token it ended up being. It was an uplifting process, and one that I said was life-changing.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. Tali, to you now. Your background, you did a Masa program at Bezalel, I understand, as well. It's a ZFA program too. Your background,
I did.
to make Aliyah. And your...
Sure. So when thinking of what brought me to Israel, I think it really was a combination of many life events and encounters and experiences, one of them being my study time at Bezalel. And that exposed me to the many layers of Israel and inspired and strengthened the Jewish identity and my Jewish and Israeli identity, which Michael talked about, like the sense of belonging, which I also definitely feel being here. And which in turn, it led me to want to build my life in Israel. My home upbringing, my education at Harari College, and my involvement in the Hineni youth movement gave me a really deep love for the Jewish homeland. But it really was through the many trips that I made here, from my first time in 2004 at age 16 with my school band, where I still remember being in Bangkok and thinking, oh my God, the next time I stand on land, I will be in Israel. I was very emotional about the whole situation. And all the trips I took until I made Aliyah, I guess took me on a personal identity journey. I came here as a tourist, and I came here on educational programs. I was here on student exchange, for family celebrations. I was a leader on many Israel programs for young adults, and then as the director of Israel programs for August. All of these trips presented me with like unique and diverse Israel experiences, showed me to new places, new narratives, new situations, and gave me opportunities to learn and to grow and to meet people. And I feel that all really shaped me as a person, and over time and over the journey made me realize that Israel was the place that I wanted to call home.
And did you speak Hebrew well before you made Aliyah?
Not so well. I had the basic Hebrew, basic understanding. When I first moved here, I lived in Tel Aviv, so it's very easy to get around as an English speaker. And then I lived for about 10 months in Herzliya, so again, very easy for English speakers. But then I moved to the Arava, which is between the Dead Sea and Eilat on the border with Jordan. And I live in a small community called Sapir. And while there are actually other Australians that live in the Arava, it's a very Hebrew-speaking environment. But I look at that as a positive thing. For the first 3 years when I moved here, I actually worked as a high school teacher in the local high school, and every time I gave my students words to learn in English, I would learn the Hebrew. And while I'm not fluent, I can definitely I feel comfortable to sit in a meeting or in a conversation and understand. I can definitely converse. I might not be, 100% and have to put in English words here and there, but I definitely feel that I have ability with language, yeah.
Thank you, Tali. Okay, Jason, lucky last. What motivated you to make Aliyah? Tell us a bit about your background and what you're doing now in Israel.
Beautiful. So my story is a little shorter, but in 2010, finished my degree, and I realized that it was time for a change. And so if you ever want to work out who you are and what you're made out of, this is a great country to do it. And I'd visited here twice before in the past, and my goal was to do my part to give back to the country, and I wanted to join the military. That's where I met your son as well. And interestingly, my fiance's name is Hadass, so that's another commonality. But yeah, in 2010, I got here in January, didn't know anyone, didn't know the language, and by December 2010, I'd already started my service. That was a 4-year process. And when I finished that, I decided that this is the place that I want to make my home. And a lot of my friends that were in these units and served with me, they all went overseas and tried to start a business venture there. And I decided that for me, it was important to show what was possible here. And so I started my first company with professional athletes. And today I work at Frontline Leadership, which is really the systems, the mindsets, the foundations that I learned in the Special Forces. But I found over time that there's a real carryover effect into your personal and professional life. When you're talking about navigating uncertainty, crisis situations, I probably met Michael at some point without us even knowing, but we would fly with the Blackhawks and we would go pick up the injured people on the border, and we would fly them back into Israel and get them the best treatment possible at places like, where Michael works. So that's what I'm doing now, is really partnering with different emerging leaders, people my age that are, in the professional realm, that are navigating all of these challenges with the new environment that we find ourselves in, and looking to build teams and all things like that. So in the military, we say, if you're going to jump out of a plane, it's always better to jump with someone. And so we become a loyal partner with them on their experience and journey.
Were you in a youth movement growing up, Jason? What was your Zionist input as a youngster?
I went to Carmel School. I dipped my finger in a couple of youth movements, but I was never connected to anything like that. I did 2 trips to Israel before making the decision. And then really before I finished my last exam and I got offered a job in Perth, I said, this is just not for me. I need to do something different. And I got on the first plane out of Perth, and it's been almost 11 years now since I've been here.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for the introduction. So now I want to ask you a question, and you've covered this to some extent, at least the positive side. What are the most exciting or inspiring things about living in Israel? And by way of contrast, what have been the most challenging parts of living in Israel? This is, we're big people. We can take the good with the bad. So you don't have to, it's not a Hasbara evening. So you can tell us what you really think about some of those things. So let's start with Sarah again.
I guess the positives, there's a feeling here of community, which is very hard to describe, but I get that feeling when I used to say on the milk cartons around holiday times, you see Chag Sameach printed next to the expiry date. It says Chag Sameach, and I look at my milk and I think that's really cute. Or on the buses, it's got the bus number and it will say Chag Sameach on the buses, and everyone says Shabbat Shalom on a Thursday. Or if you're walking past eating a falafel and a pita, some stranger just says B'tei Avon, like Bon Appetit. There's this feeling of community here, which I just love, and I sort of feel that when I'm in Australia. But it's a funny one, when I go home to Australia, I sometimes feel a bit Israeli, but I also feel like I'm going home. And then I come back to Israel and I feel like I'm coming home. So I think that there's no problem in having 2 homes and feeling like you're at home in 2 different places, surrounded by people that you love in 2 different places. It's a positive. Maybe one of the harder things with the culture here, which won't come as news to anyone, there is a major culture difference. I mean, like I said, I've been here for 15 years and I'm still always finding myself at the end of the queues. Like I can't bring it in. I don't have it in me to push to the front of the line or to ask someone if I can just jump in because I only have 3 items in my basket. It's just not part of the mentality here. I guess a good thing, a silver lining of Corona is that Israelis learned how to line up. It was the first time I ever saw people standing in line, 2 meters apart outside shops, which was a nice change. But these are all very small things. I think in general, there's a wonderful sense of community, as I said, and for some people, it can be a bit harder to take is the nature, the Israeli nature here of being very much living close together. Learning how to drive is scary because of the road rage and the way people behave on the roads. But if you can handle it, then you can handle anything.
Did you ever think in the 15 years about coming back to Australia? You thought it was too hard?
No, I never felt it was too hard. Of course, there's this constant ebb and flow of, where is home? Where do I want to raise the kids? But, time passes and this is where I've built my home. I got married here. I've raised my children here. I very much think of myself as Israeli, but like Sting likes to think about, being an Englishman in New York. I'm under no false impressions. I will always be an Australian in Israel. I'm not as Israeli as my Israeli friends. There's something different about me here, but that's okay. Israel is a nice melting pot of many, cultures, especially in Tel Aviv. I don't know about the other areas, but in Tel Aviv, people come from all over. So it's okay to bring a little bit of your home with you here.
Okay, Michael, your thoughts on that?
I'd have to change your question a little bit because it's not as if it's dichotomous, the bad and the good. In a sense, part of the good is the bad and part of the bad is the good. Because Israel is this terrible paradox where the sum total of the individual parts ends up being much better than the actual individual parts. So there's so many terrible things in Israel, things that we would like to change, so many disappointments, so many things different to what I got in Habonim or Bnei Akiva as a youth, a member of the youth groups. The conflict between the religious and the non-religious, in some ways I despair at both sides. The rudeness, of course, can't not affect anyone who comes from Australia's background, but the society is always being sort of drawn to its very, very limits, and it always seems to be at risk of breaking down, and yet the sum total always comes up in a non-algebraic way as being positive. All these negatives put together, how can it possibly end up as being positive? But it is positive. I can only affirm what Sarah said, the sense of belonging here is an extraordinary feeling. It's not something that you get every minute of every day, but you wake up in the morning without having to ask, well, why on earth am I here, or why am I on earth? Because just being here already achieves something. I would like to add an element that perhaps was touched on when people were giving their own biographies, and that's the notion of Hebrew in general. I found it so helpful to deepen my roots here by learning Hebrew well. I came from Mount Scopus, and like anyone who sort of graduated from Mount Scopus, I could read the alphabet and do a few prayers, but I couldn't really speak Hebrew. And I did a tour guide course 3 years ago, and it was all in Hebrew. And I passed, I topped my class in an exam that was done in Hebrew, and it was such a wonderful feeling to be part of the recreation of the Hebrew language to modern Israel. So I can read Wikipedia in Hebrew more easily than I can in English now. And that's a wonderful thing which has enhanced my sense of belonging here. So the Hebrew language itself is something wonderful. And of course, the tour guide is a symptom of something else, something that was missing, which the tour guide course fulfilled for me, and that is to understand the history profound history of almost every single place where you walk deepens even more one's attachment to the country. So, Hebrew and the knowledge of history that you acquire by living here has done wonderful things for me. Tough society, though.
Thank you, Michael. Tali, the good and the bad.
The good and the bad. I guess I also want to elaborate on what both Sarah and Michael have said in terms of the sense of community and the belonging. And another thing I really love is, going to the supermarket, and you always know what time of year it is because of the products that are on sale. You know all the dairy products will be on sale around Shavuot. You know that the chocolate gelt will be on sale around Hanukkah. There's a real sense of community and Jewish festivities and Jewish life. Everything kind of comes together so nicely. And the fact that you go to a Roma before Chag and you get a chocolate saying Chag Sameach, or you think you're going to be going to your cousins, aunties, brothers for, Rosh Hashanah dinner, and then you think it's only going to be 10 people and suddenly there's 50 people sitting at the table. I think it's an amazing feeling and an amazing sense of togetherness that I think people have spoken about, and we really feel it. In terms of where I live, I think community is even taken to a deeper level because I live in an area which is considered very much the periphery and considered one of the most isolated regions in Israel. And we're about 3,500-4,000 people living across 7 communities. And we don't have, all the services that you would get living in a city. For example, for doctors, we only have certain days with doctors. If we need to go to a specialist appointment, we have to maybe travel an hour and 15 minutes to Eilat or an hour and a half to Beersheba. But it's a lifestyle that you learn to live with because you want to live with, and it's got a lot of positives. But we also, we don't have the same services and things like that you would in the city. But having said that, the sense of community is incredible here. And for example, growing my family here, I don't have to worry about where my children are in the afternoons or make play dates. Because it just sort of all comes together here. And I feel that I have like a very, very positive a lifestyle, like family lifestyle and a beautiful way of life, even though I'm very much living on the periphery. And for me, challenges or the bad, I guess it would be what I said before, that living on the periphery and not having the same services or the things available to me. But as I said, you learn to adapt and live with what you have.
So Tali, you said the periphery, and the Arava is quite far from the center of the country. Have you felt that?
Yeah.
You obviously haven't needed, I mean, we know the syndrome of many young Australian Olim, they go to Jerusalem, they live in Katamon Yeshena or Baka or in Tel Aviv, in areas where they want to hang out with other Australians or Lims speak English. You didn't feel you needed that type of support? You could jump in at the deep end?
I definitely started my Aliyah time here in very much a safety net of comfort. When I was living in Tel Aviv, and at the time when I made Aliyah, there were quite a few of my close friends. We all made it around the same time. So I definitely started in a comfort zone. But I guess as I then decided, my husband and I, we decided, where do we see us growing a family? Where do we see us living? And because of my time that I had spent here in the Arava, through the partnership program, we had this like crazy idea of like, why not go try live in the desert, see what happens? Worst case, we go for a year or 2 years, we can always come back to the center, to the comforts. And the feeling that I was met with the first time that I came here returned to me when I came when we moved here now nearly 5 years ago. And I think I have a different like comfort and safety net because I'm still in contact with many of the people that I met on my first time here that have really, you know, they were there for me when we moved. They helped, you know, gave us numbers of places to find houses and gave me contacts for jobs. Like, as I said, like it's a very much sense of community and people wanting to see people succeed and be here. And so yeah, I guess I have a different safety net now, and not still linked to Australia, but a different type of Australian link.
All right, thank you, Tali. Jason, your highs and lows, and I want to particularly ask you, you know, I think you may be the only one of the panelists who've served in the army, if I'm correct. That experience wouldn't have been easy in one of the Sayarot. We also know many of the people that finish there or go back to their own communities. You didn't make that decision, obviously. So what about some of those challenges and your connections with Australians? You seem to be working with, you know, ex-soldiers a lot. How important has that been to your Aliyah?
Very important. The military, we needed probably a couple of days to go over the challenges and things there, but, you know, I experienced it all, from not having a place to stay for a couple of months during training to them leaving my baggage in Bangkok when I went home to visit my family, and going into one of the hardest sections of our training without any equipment or anything that I had and bought in Australia. So there's a lot with that. And I think the second part of your question is really relevant, because we were a very tight group of about 15 people that trained together, that all got into, you know, very decent units, very ambitious people that want to be here. And out of the 14, only about 2 or 3 survived here in Israel. And my experience, and this is just from my experience, that's been mainly because of the professional side of what they're looking to get out of their life, you know, in terms of financially, in terms of growing a business, starting a business, finding new opportunities. And the main reason that I joined this call is to create a conversation here and another potential opportunity, because, I mean, I didn't know anyone on this call. And I know that there are a ton of very, very strong organizations working in the background in Australia. But as someone who's here on the ground, I'm really looking at a new possibility for us to have a much, much stronger connection. I know that friends of mine from Australia, they couldn't find anywhere to get a scholarship. I know that I myself have been able to employ over 10 Olim and ex-lone soldiers, because for me, if I can be a small part of the solution of keeping people here and showing them that, you know, we together can build something, can create something, you know, can make a successful story here, I think that that's incredibly important. And I think that it's not about, you know, more funding. You know, at some point it might be that, but I think that there's a network here in Israel and in Australia of Australians that are working, that can work together, and that can start to bridge the very, you know, the gap, the very large distance between the two countries. But we can start to connect more. We can start to have those conversations. We can start to see what Australian organizations can help Australian-run startups. I know a few here that are really, you know, having a tough time at the moment. And I'm sure that there are much more things that we can do. And I take full responsibility of me not knowing more about these organizations and who to reach out to. But I've been here almost 11 years and I've had very little to no connection with the Australian community, the Australian network. And I know that my friends who have left and friends who are still here, I know that there is an opportunity for all of us to come together and create a new conversation, a new possibility. And that's what I'm really, really interested in.
Well, Sarah said at the beginning, at the outset, that she's built up quite a big Facebook community. There seems to be an opportunity to make a shidduch here between the two of you to try and achieve two goals there. Sarah, what do you think about that?
I think that's something that Jason raises here is worth raising, about people leaving. Over the years, I've made many friends here, let's call them Anglo friends from all over, not just Australia, that end up leaving, going back home, because life as an Ola is difficult. And I think we all have friends that have, you know, left. And I think every year Israel itself has more Yordim than Olim. They don't like to admit it, but it is the truth. So anything that can be done to make life a bit easier, and it starts with the community, it's the right way to go. And Jason's part of our Facebook group, and I think Tali's also part of it, and Michael, you welcome to join if you're not already. It's a very useful group to have. It's like a lifeline here to try and network. And Jason is right. Anything that can be done to keep people here, whether it's looking for jobs or just looking for guidance or support or help, it's worthwhile. It's important.
So Philip, I'm more like I actually know a few Australians here and we're in contact. I think that with the people that are watching this, the opportunity is more in the organizations or the businesses or the people that are based in Australia that are looking for that connection, that are looking to see what, joint ventures we can do, where we can work together, how we can push forward as a community, because I've been a part of all of these so many non-profit organizations. I understand the politics, I understand the time that it takes to push things through. And I'm here saying that, and I'm sure Sarah and Tali and Michael, we're here on the ground and I go around a lot. And so whatever ideas, whatever potential is, whatever people want to get done, I'm not here to talk about long-term, things that are going to take a few years. There are things that we can do in the very short term to, start to really help those who are leaving. And people, like Sarah said, people leave this country often, and a lot of them have amazing ideas, amazing, business ventures, and they go out and they make their sales or their exits in America or in Australia. And I'm just wondering what it's going to take for us to build that potential here with a very strong connection to the Australian community.
Well, I think you've put a challenge out to us in particular, Jason, the ZFA and other organizations here. So I think it's something we do have to take on board. You're 100% right. For someone to, spend 3 or 4 years, for example, in an elite unit, give so much of their life to the country and then leave after that seems to be people move all the time. It's true, but it seems to be some extent a terrible waste. And if there can be opportunities for people to stay, well, obviously we've got a very, very keen interest in encouraging and supporting that.
One last thing. That's completely our responsibility for not doing that first. This is not, I don't think this is about more handouts or more, anything like that. It's really how do we find a value exchange that works for both sides, that can create an ongoing kind of conversation, an ongoing opportunity, so that we don't need to get back to, why this wasn't done, to blame this. It's more about what we can do together moving forward. This is not about handouts or anything. This is about
No, I understand that. No, and the point's well made, Jason. If I can ask now another question, all of you mentioned that, when it's Chag, you can tell from the food on the shelves or the signs on a bus. In particular, your Jewish identity, before you made Aliyah and since, has Israel made you more Jewish, less relevant because it's part of the atmosphere, it's in the water, or in fact, have you become less interested because it's just, the way the country operates? Your thoughts on that? Tali, let's start with you.
I came, growing up in Australia, I came from from a modern Orthodox household. We Shomer Shabbat, Shomer Kosher. So for me, being here, it's like I think that was part of my identity, that everything was made easier for me, I didn't have to, in Australia, you would for kosher products. Now it's more available in kosher sections in the supermarket. But back then you would go to the kosher shops or the kosher bakeries or the kosher butcher. Whereas here it's like you go and it's part of your lifestyle. You go to the supermarket, you can buy any cheese, you can buy any meat. For me, it was very eye-opening for me that no matter where you are on the belief or religious spectrum, you really do feel. And I think that's something that's really nice. I feel that living in the diaspora, you're always doing things so you feel. You're always preparing for Shabbat a few days before, because Shabbat is coming and you want to feel Shabbat. Like my mom, I know you're watching, hi, every week she asks me, what am I doing for Shabbat? For me, I never really know what we're doing for Shabbat, but we will always have Shabbat, we always have Kiddush, we always have a nice family meal, because it just happens, it's part of life here. And so it was amazing as well to be able to see, you know, for some people, Shabbat is going to the beach with friends and having, you know, watermelon, or for some people Shabbat is, you know, going to shul and family meals. But everything goes here, and I think being exposed to that has actually given me a richer identity and richer Jewish experience.
Okay, very interesting. Michael, your thoughts? I know you went through a few different religious phases in your life. I'm interested in where you are now.
Yeah, I'll take one step back before I go forwards, because I also served in the army. So I just want to say a little bit about that, because it was so important to me. This was admittedly in the 1980s, but as a 35-year-old, I did a very short army service, but then did officers course and got roped into an elite combat unit, supposedly, but we never had any combat because it was the ski patrol, and I was only there because I knew how to ski. So I was the doctor of the ski patrol, but nonetheless, it was such a significant part of my first Aliyah in the 1980s and 1990s that I can't let it go by. I sort of look at Jason and I think almost I'm envious of that experience, and I recognise, I can still taste some of it myself, the certain pride that I had at serving in the IDF. And I would recommend it to anyone, although it could backfire because a lot of people have such unpleasant army experiences. But I was very, very fortunate, and I'm grateful that I was an officer in the Israeli army. The religious side, like so many things, cuts both ways here. I remember when I was a little bit younger, they issued a stamp, a postage stamp in the days where people used to send letters. They issued a postage stamp with Rashi on the postage stamp. And I thought, wow, even if you're totally secular, you get to see this figure of Rashi, and somehow you imbibe the Rashiness of being here without ever having read, you know, Rashi's commentaries on the Torah or on the Talmud. And so there's that actually wonderful side. But on the other side, I can't ignore the need here to join the polarization of the society. You don't have an active middle ground here. You have to somehow declare yourself to be either religious or irreligious. You have to go to a school that's religious or irreligious. You're forever having to define yourself according to the extremes of the society, even if you don't belong to the extremes of society. And I think that's a very unfortunate part of the Jewishness. It's, I think, best summarized as saying that church and state are not separate here. And it's a great shame. It took Europe many hundreds of years to learn that lesson of the importance of separating the church and state. But here you can't do it because religion has become so, or is so political. So it's paradoxically perhaps more difficult here to live a fulfilling Jewish life because it is so involved in the political aspects of it, which it isn't in Melbourne or Sydney or Perth. Yeah.
So you become less committed to practice because of that?
Yes, because I have my problems with some aspects of the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jews, but I also have problems with the secular. I haven't become, in my heart, more secular or more religious or ultra-religious. I just find that the paradox of being in Israel is that you can find yourself belonging less religiously than you did in Australia. In Australia, you have to, as Tali said, you have to, in a sense, always you have to work in order to make your Jewishness. You have to actively arrange for Shabbat. But here you don't have to. Everything is Shabbat. Even the Hell's Angels go home to their parents on Friday night and have Shabbat dinner. You know, it's so you effortlessly take on parts of the religion, but you also effortlessly become disenchanted with it. So it's this, again, dichotomous type arrangement.
All right, Jason, over to you. But if I take Michael's point up, if you agree with it, it seems a bit sad to me that, you know, make Aliyah to the Jewish state and you then come out with views like that about commitment to religion or practice or whatever it may be. Your thoughts on that?
I'm not going to get into the politics of religion, but you know, for me, just doing what I can for, I think we just define it differently. What I can do for the state and for the people is very different to what others can do. And you know, I'm packing my bags, and next week I'm going to reserve duty. I have to close down everything from Sunday to Wednesday, and I've been called up, and so I'll be going and doing that. And so, you know, for me, I was just in Sfat where Michael is now sitting, and I experienced that for the last few days, and the culture and the different people, it's always around you and it's always present. And I don't particularly get into the details of it, but you know, I've been enjoying the politics of it and just observing it from the side for the last 10 and a half, 11 years, and just doing the things that are right for me and that feel right. So that's kind of my approach to it.
Great. Sarah, your thoughts?
I think it's a very personal and subjective thing. I don't think that I can say I feel more Jewish living in Israel, but I do think that my Judaism has been enriched with culture and tradition that would have been more difficult for me to tap into in Australia. So for example, I married a Moroccan. Let's just call him very Moroccan. Both his parents are Moroccan and they take their tradition very seriously. This means, whether I like it or not, I now host a Mimuna every year after Pesach with 80 people, and I'm okay with that. That it's part of, you know, the Jewish tradition coming to life. And whether or not if I forget that it's Purim, I cannot forget that it's Purim when living in Israel. You just take one step out the door, and you know, the bus drivers are dressed as schoolgirls. There are many on Sukkot. If I want to shake a lulav or etrog, I don't need to find my way to the rabbi in Sydney or to a synagogue or yeshiva to try and work out what day I can go and shake it. Because on every street corner here, there's people here trying to encourage people to do that. So there's many other examples. I was just at a family socially distanced bar mitzvah last week, which took place in the forests near Tzfat, at the site of an ancient synagogue in the middle of the forest. I mean, that's just something which is wonderful, that it brings to life your Jewish heritage and your Jewish roots in a way that it's a vibrant way of living Jewishly that I don't know if it's necessarily on the spectrum of being more religious or less religious, but it's my Judaism feels more alive here.
Oh, very good. Very interesting. Okay. I'm not sure we have any questions from the audience that I can see coming up. So if we do, I'll see it in a minute. So let me ask you one to sort of start to wrap it up a little bit. I think it's been fascinating. Thank you very much, all of you. Recommendations about making Aliyah. And you're all, I almost say Vatikim. You've been in Israel quite some time, and you have great examples of the success story of Australian Aliyah. Someone's thinking about it now. What would be your advice to them in a deeper sense about preparing for this big event and trying to make it as successful as possible? Tali, your thoughts?
I would say don't overthink it. Just do it. That's kind of what I did. Yes, I had the journey that got me to the point where I was like, yes, I'm doing Aliyah. But before I came here, I didn't know where I would be working or what I would be doing. Ironically, I actually signed my lease for my apartment in Tel Aviv, and then I went home, made Aliyah, and came back. So I did have an apartment. So I had somewhere to live. But I didn't have all the answers, and that's okay, because it will come, and it's like you're making the process until, okay, I want to make Aliyah, but then the next part of the journey opens and the next chapter opens, and not to be afraid to take any experience. Like I'm an art teacher, so when I came here, I emailed all the international schools and said, hi, I'm an art teacher, do you have any job openings? And that actually led me to my first job that I had. Just to really take it all as it comes, And as I said, just don't overthink it. Get on the plane, and the rest will unfold as you're here.
Okay, Jason, you sound like a guy who's pretty organized and prepared and planned things out. What do you say? Tali or not?
Going on.
I think I'm the opposite.
Going on Tali, I'd be very cautious of getting advice. I think that it's such a personal thing, and it's, you know, you'll never understand anything until you experience it. And so, you know, if it's right for you and you're willing to take the jump, and it really is a jump, then you know, get a couple of different stories, a couple of different, you know, insights. But other than that, it's really it's something that each person needs to do themselves and go through that process. And just, you know, don't buy into all of the stories, because most of them are you know, aren't exactly what they put out to be. So that'll be my 2 cents.
Okay, Michael.
Like some of the best marriages, the first 50 or 60 years are the hardest, and after that it's a piece of cake. You know, you don't have to. But I think in some ways, in order to not have your expectations deflated too much, you have to start with a realism or a lower expectations. It is very hard, especially in the first few years, for anyone making Aliyah. The cultural and language changes are sometimes daunting, and there are days where you think, what on earth is happening here? But the sahakol, the totality of the experience of Aliyah, is a wonderful one. I think it's often made easier by having friends, especially if we've left all our family and close friends behind. You do need to buffer it buffer the experience of Aliyah by having a handful, at least, a small network of close friends. I would urge anyone who's thinking of making Aliyah to take the language on, though, as a real project. It does help very much if you can sort of blend into the society by having fluent Hebrew. And I wasn't a good student at Mount Scopus College. I'm sure Mrs. Orbach, my Hebrew teacher, is very happy to now hear me saying that she laid a foundation. You have to work on that foundation. So I think learning Hebrew is actually quite important to integrating into the society, but it is possible. And after a few years, as I say, it feels more at home being here than being in other parts of the world.
Thank you. And last but not least, Sarah, and I think you've put the Facebook address on the screen for everybody, which some were asking about that. So thank you for that.
Sure. I would just say to make it work. Don't rely on things to be given to you or information to be sent to you to make it as easy as possible. Put yourself out there, get uncomfortable, go network, meet people, apply for the jobs, get involved, go to events, join the relevant groups, make it work.
Okay, wow. Simple, but very much to the point. I want to thank you again. It's been a real privilege, a real eye-opener to see you still so committed, so successful, so it seems to me at least very integrated into Israeli life. Is just a wonderful testament, of course, to you, but I think also to the Australian community for having given you that background and that education and that commitment. We're very proud of you. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us tonight. I'd now like to hand over to Bren.
Phil, thank you so much. And to all of our panelists, thank you. That was quite amazing to hear 4 very different perspectives on what took you to Israel and what has kept you in Israel, and the networks you've made. It was just marvelous. So thank you. Look, I'll wrap up now. It's almost 9 o'clock. Can I just say 2 things? If you are interested in finding out more information about Aliya, we won't get you to sign on the dotted line straight away, but why don't you email OzAliya, that's OZALIYA @jaffe.org, that's JAFI.org. You will find out more information about the possibilities of Aliya. Or go to the Aussies in Israel Facebook page, ask questions, and as you know now, there's a very great network of people in Israel. One final thing, this Tuesday night, the ZFA will have its executive meeting, and what we'll be doing at the executive meeting is launching, or at least academics from Monash University will be launching a survey of Olim in Israel, Australian Olim, I might add. They'll be talking about their thoughts, the challenges, their identity. Everything that we've discussed tonight is in a very well-researched and detailed survey. That ZFA executive meeting, for the first time ever, will be live streamed on Facebook. We'll have the details on the ZFA Facebook page in the next couple of days, but just go there. I think it's 7:30, but again, the details live Tuesday night, you'll see it. So we'll wrap that up there. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the people on Zoom and on Facebook. And we will see you at 8 o'clock next week.